Okay, so this recording started. So how are things? Is there anything you'd like to share? Haribo.
Not much new. Everything is good. Staying in best health as possible here. Keeping active. And a lot of work going on in the publishing department, so that's always good. What are the questions this morning?
So I'm having trouble streaming it on Facebook right now. Padmanabha Swami, do you want to ask one of the questions from the Spanish speaking devotees?
Yes. Yes. Well, thank you for that opportunity. Srivasa Thakur, of course, is a member of the Panchatattva, and he represents the prospect of the Tatastha Shakti, the Jiva, like ourselves, to function in the spiritual world. That is the very kind of definition of Tatastha, neither here nor there, or here or there, I guess you could say, in terms of its neither here nor there unto itself, and either here or there, it can function on either side relative to the influence it comes under, that of the svarupa-sakti or that of the maya-sakti. So it can function on either side. And the fact that it can function in the spiritual world in a way that seamlessly corresponds with the eternal associates of Krishna, who are essential in order for there to be a Krishna. In other words, in order for there to be a son of Yashoda, there has to be a Yashoda. In order for there to be a lover of Radha, there has to be a Radha. For there to be a friend of Subal, there has to be a Subal. So that's a given, that if there's rasa, there's lila, then there have to be associates of Krishna that function as the object, as the shelters, the ashrayalam, the shelters of the love that he is the object of, and they have to be eternal. So the question then, given that fact, theologically speaking, the question is, can we, who are Tatastha Shakti, and are not required in order for Krishna to be who he is, so to speak, in terms of the Leela, can we participate in that realm? And if so, how does that work? Or how do we fit in, so to speak? And we know that there are Tatastha Jivas under the Maya Shakti. Here we find ourselves in such a condition. We know that it results in a material, psychophysiological personhood, personality, and that it's ephemeral. It's here today and it's going to be gone tomorrow. Aside from that influence of the Maya Shakti, we exist, nonetheless, but do we have a capacity to exist in that realm and function in that realm where Krishna and his associates play out their Leela. And so the person of Srivasa in the Panchatattva exemplifies that possibility that the Tatastha Jiva can function in the spiritual world seamlessly as an associate of Krishna, as an eternal associate does, following in the bhava of one such associate. That's one of the reasons that also that there are said to be not only nitya baddha, eternally conditioned souls, there are some nitya siddha jiva, nitya siddha tatastas. So the possibility that we can exist there as a tatastha jiva. And this is exemplified in one sense in the Panchatattva through Srivasa. So that's he is often coupled with, in any glorification of him, Shivasadi Gaur, Bhakta Vrinda, the whole Shivas and the whole group of devotees. It means Adi, Vrinda, the whole, etc., the whole group of bhaktas. So basically, it's referring to entities like ourselves. And so he's very important to us and very encouraging. And that said, aside from a more basic tattva perspective, if we want to go to rasa tattva, then often, or repeatedly, I should say, unanimously, Srivasa is identified with Narada Muni. Narada Muni is described in different ways, sometimes as a tatastha jiva sadhana siddha, sometimes as a nitya siddha. In his commentary, Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, his commentary in the Bhagavatam, describes him as a nitya siddha and a sadhana siddha. So what that means, we can only make a reasonable conjecture, one of which would be that he's a nitya siddha, but he plays the role of a sadhana siddha, which is very clear in the Bhagavad discourse itself, where his previous life is described as having taken birth as a Gandharva, having offended the Sankirtan party, as a result, having had to take birth on earth, and without knowing who his father is, not the most auspicious birth, but nonetheless, the positive effect of coming in touch with the Sankirtan was that he got the association of the Bhakti Vedantas, as Prabhupada describes them, traveling mendicant devotees who were hosted in his mother's home during the rainy season. There he heard the Bhagavad discourse, and what he heard rang very true to him after the departure of the devotees in the end of the rainy season, when his mother was bitten by a snake and passed away. And so he turned the house into a funeral pyre and burned the house and walked off. In other words, one of the themes, obviously, that would have repeatedly come up in the discourse of the Bhakti Vedantas was the temporary nature of the world. All things must pass, and so on and so forth. So he saw it play out in a prominent way with the passing of his mother. He didn't have a father that was present or known, and so he followed their advice. Anyway, he burned the whole house and himself became a mendicant. So the story goes. And of course, in this context, he had the darshan of Krishna, and was at a stage which was like the penultimate stage of his spiritual progress, only to encourage him to go the distance and perfect himself. In that regard, in the Sandarbhas of Jiva Goswami, Nard is given as an example of a, was it Nirduta Kashai? I can't remember the term. There's 3 types of Mahabhagavats he describes. Sridhar Maharaj gave an analogy that I think corresponds with this. One Mahabhagavat has 2 feet here, but his eyes are there. One has 1 foot here and extends another foot there. Another has 2 feet there and extends 1 here. So Bhagavat Prapta Deha, who has a spiritual body, is functioning in this world. One who, like Sukadeva, like Nard, is again another way of describing Nard. He's here in a spiritual body. In the other end of the spectrum, with 2 feet here and his eyes there, he's described as having darshan in the penultimate stage of his progress, and then getting a spiritual body, and so forth. So Nard is an example of 2 types of Mahabhagavats, on the lower end of the spectrum and the higher end of the spectrum, in terms of descriptions of him throughout the sacred texts. And then Sukadeva is given as an example by Jiva Goswami of one who had 1 foot here and extended a foot there, so to speak. So anyway, Nard, who Srivasa Thakur is identified with, is described in different ways. The Bhagavad also describes him in the 1st canto, 3rd chapter, as a type of incarnation of Bhagavan. Sometimes he's referred to as by the term Bhagavan also. So a paradigmatic figure, and I think that again, the prominent idea is a perfected, one way or another, Tatasta Shakti, and perhaps empowered, like Avesh, to give bhakti. So we know that Nard is a participant in Krishna Lila in Goloka, but primarily in Dwaraka. He also came to Mathura and advised Kamsa in such a way that the Lila's progression would accelerate. And he has, as that being an example, a peculiar nature that causes him to sometimes be referred to as a farcical Brahman. He acts a little bit out of characteristic of a Brahman at times. However, his participation in Dwaraka and Mathura, which is more prominent, does not preclude his participation in the Braj Lila itself, where Jiva Goswami has explained that his source, the farcical Brahman of the Braj Lila, Madhumangal, plays such a prominent role. He's the Brahmin Pujari in the house of Nanda Maharaj, an adopted son, so to speak, of Nanda Maharaj and Yasoda. He lives there. And the idea, of course, is as Krishna expands himself into different Leelas, for example, the Mathura Leela, the Dwarka Leela, to interact with devotees who have corresponding bhavas in those residences, in those places. So his associates in Braj also expand with him. So Nard is in this sense, the expansion of Madhumangal, which would be, as Madhumangal, his Braj Leela representation. So I like to think of Srivasa Thakur along these lines, and as there is evidence from Jiva Goswami in his Gopal Champu, where he mentions this point. There is also evidence to support this identification of Srivasa Thakur with Madhu Mangal in Chaitanya Bhagavat and in Chaitanya Charitamrita. In Chaitanya Charitamrita, in Navadvip, I believe it's in Navadvip. Navadvip in the Adi Leela, at a point where Chaitanya Mahaprabhu enters into Krishna Bhav and calls for his flute. Where's my flute? Where's my flute? Srivasa Thakur answers as a close friend of Krishna, and he says, it's been stolen by the gopis. So that's not something he would say in Gopi Bhav. But in the Bhav of Madhu Mangal, he would say, the gopis stole it. They're the ones, and so forth. And then he serves Chaitanya Mahaprabhu in the Bhav of Krishna by reminding him of the Gopi Leelas and so forth that Narmasakas like Madhu Mangal are familiar with. Of course, he's a Narmasaka, but he's a Brahmana. So in that sense, he's not someone to follow. You don't want to become a Brahmin associate of Madhu Mangal. He has his Brahmin assistant entourage in Braj, as Subal has his entourage, expansions, associates, Sridham, all of these paradigmatic figures in Sakiras, which is the subject when we talk about Madhu Mangal. But nonetheless, he is a very prominent example of that bhava. We want to enter as an abhira or as a vaishya, an abhira in this caste. Vaishya with a little mixture of the Brahminical influence, like Krishna himself. But at any rate, he's a Vidusaka, he's a clown, he's a farcical Brahmin, obviously. He, in so many ways, Srivasa Thakur's Madhu Mangal in the Braj Leela makes light of the Brahminical pride, if you will, that within Varnashram, the Brahmins are subject to, and is said to be a symptom of Kali Yuga. So through his nature and whatnot, I mean, he's a farcical Brahmin. He's a joke of a Brahmin, if you will, and plays a very prominent role in all of the Leela Granthas of the Goswamis. Anyway, back to Gaur Leela. When Chaitanya Mahaprabhu asked for his flute, then very much in the mood of Madhu Mangal, Srivasa Thakur responds. Later in Jagannath Puri, again, during the Ratha Yatra, in the midst of that, when there is the Hare Panchami festival, and the goddess becomes upset with Jagannath and starts to play somewhat of a dominant role in the Leela. Mahaprabhu is relishing this, and he asks, or he sets up a debate between Srivasa Thakur and Swarup Damodar. Swarup Damodar taking the role of Vrindavan, and Srivasa Thakur in the Bhav of Narada taking up the role of Vaikuntha, which has greater opulence. And as Srivasa Thakur in the mode of Narada speaks about the glory and the overt opulence, if you will, of the goddess Lakshmi in Vaikuntha. On the other hand, Swarup Damodar is speaking about the greater opulence in the form of the prem of Radhika, the gopis, and the Braj Leela, that on its face may look less opulent, but in fact is really, that is where the greatest Aishvarya is shown. In the Prakat Leela, the Brahma Vimohan Leela is an example. You can't show more opulence the mat when Krishna showed Narad that Narayans were emanating from him, from whom universes were emanating, manifesting Brahmas and Shivas and so forth. This all happened in the Braj Leela. So anyway, there's a debate, and Srivasa Thakur wins, Swarup Damodar wins, and Srivasa Thakur places his hand under his arm like this and makes a noise that is typical of Madhu Mangal and cheers the victor, agreeing with him, having been put in an awkward position to defend the position of Vaikuntha over Braj, the latter of which he's more identified with as Madhu Mangal. And he goes into the bhava of Madhu Mangal at that time. Chaitanya Bhagavat, we also find him in the home, in his home, worshiping the deity of Nrsimha, which Madhu Mangal is the deity, is the pujari for, in the home of Nanda Maharaj in Vrindavan. And on one such occasion, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu comes to his door and knocks on the chambers of the deity and calls for Srivasa Thakur to open the gate, the door, and he breaks the meditation of Srivasa Thakur. And he opens the door, and there's Chaitanya Mahaprabhu standing, and he shows himself as Nrsimha and says, "He who you are worshiping is at your door, standing before you. Say something, some praise." And so he does, and he praises Krishna in the Braj Leela, in his Sesh Kumar Leela, in the Brahma Vimohan Leela, citing the beautiful description of Krishna given by Brahma at a time when Brahma, according to Vishnu Chakravarti, was transitioning from Vaidhi Bhakti into Rag Bhakti, and that following in the wake or the footsteps of Krishna's cowherd friends. So there are a number of examples to support this idea. For some reason, Kavi Karnapur did not underscore that and simply identified him with Narada. Other later acharyas have commented along the lines that I'm speaking without such detail, but identifying him with Madhu Mangal. And I think there's a really, really good, as I'm making it, case for that. And it's beautiful then to think that the very entry place of the Navadvip Leela being the Kirtan hall of Srivasa Thakur is basically an outward or external expansion of the heart of the Thakur, who is Madhu Mangal himself. So there is the role of the Narmasaka in making available entrance into the Kirtan Rasa of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, where the highest ideals of Ujjvala Rasa and whatnot can be experienced. So he's a very important figure and a very exciting figure when we play all these facts out. And we're very much indebted to him and his contribution. It's again significant that we identify with him because he's a feature of the Panchatattva that corresponds with ourselves and our prospect. Of course, our prospect is represented in other ways, but in terms of identity. So we are Tatastha Shakti. We have this prospect for Sakya-rasa, for madhurya-rasa in Braj, to live in the Paravyom. And Srivasa Thakur very much exemplifies that. So we're fortunate to be able to think about him on an auspicious day like today. Thank you for asking. Srivasa Thakur ki jai, Shri Narada Muni ki jai, Narada Muni bajai vina, Radhika Ramana name, and Madhu Mangal ji ki jai. What else?
Jai. So I forgot to tell you that there are 8 questions, or 8
No.
more questions. Um, okay, so the next question is from Agendra, and he's in the hospital right now, so he couldn't be on the call and ask. So, so I guess he'll just listen to the recording. So his question is,
Well, we have a question now. Is he all right?
I don't, does anyone have any, he's trying to get out from what I heard. That's just what I heard on Facebook, but I don't know exactly why he's in the hospital.
He had a pretty bad infection, and he's getting better though. He had a really bad fever and stuff, but he's recovering pretty quickly.
Okay, good. So what is his question?
Yeah, his question is, how is it that Krishna's friends can still tease him even after seeing him defeat great demons like Trnavarta, Bakasura, and Aghasura?
How can they tease him? Well, um, the cowherds think that they themselves are capable of defeating those demons. Hmm? And they're right. They're right. But by the arrangement of Lila Shakti, they defer to Krishna. And he is their leader because he's the son of the king of Vraj, the king of the cowherds. So he should show himself as such, even though any one of them could do it, they think, him. And then they egg Ram on also to do such demon slaying, if you will, in the Prakat Lila, in the case of Dhanakasura. They egged him on and they praised him for his defeat of Pralamba, but they don't feel that they praise Krishna, what he's done, well done, well done. But you know, they have the experience that despite the fact that Krishna could kill Bakasur, Aghasur, and so forth, it doesn't change that nothing changes. It doesn't change the fact that Sridham can defeat him in wrestling. So, you know, and any one of them feels they could as well, on any given occasion, given the chance, and they're right. So they have every reason to praise him for the work, and if some thought should come in their mind of his divinity, then it will be that, oh, he looks like he's some kind of a god. And they'll think, that's cool. We're all gods. We're all some kind of gods. Must be. Maybe in our previous birth or something like that. So the very nature of Sakiras is sama, a sense of equality with Krishna. They see him lifting Govardhan Hill. How can they then tease him and belittle him even? Well, even in the midst of lifting Govardhan Hill, they think he needs help, right? And they hold their own sticks up to help him hoist the hill. So such is the nature of their sense of equality with him. It's not an absolute equality, but a oneness in kind. They're of the same kind. Next question.
Padmanabha Swami, do you want to ask another question from the Spanish-speaking devotees?
Yes. Right. Well, I think this is the simple way to do that is to differentiate between Vishnu slaying a demon in one of his other Leela avatars like Vraja or Ram, Narasimha, and the Vishnu in Krishna defeating a demon in Braj, or it may be outside of Braj in Mathura, where he's dealt with Kamsa, or in Dwarka. But it's still, I would say there's a difference between Vishnu and a Vishnu avatar doing it and the Vishnu composite within Swami Bhagavan himself doing it. That has an extra added effect, if you will. So it's Krishna doing, Vishnu, whatever Vishnu does is an aspect of himself. It's that aspect of himself. It's not a separate person that's doing it. Vishnu is an aspect of Krishna. So that aspect is within Krishna. So we can say it's not Krishna that does it, it's Vishnu, but it may be more accurate to say it's not Krishna that, it's Krishna that does it, but it's his Vishnu aspect that does it. Another question?
Eric, do you want to ask your question?
Dandavats and good morning, Maharaj. Hare Krishna. So my question is regarding a passage I read somewhat recently in the 11th chapter of the 4th canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam, when Manu speaks to Dhruva Maharaj after Dhruva's fight with the Yakshas. From earlier passages, it seems apparent that Dhruva had already become self-realized after receiving the darshan of Vishnu in the forest. However, in the purport of verse 30, Srila Prabhupada says, "But even though he was liberated, he was for the time being afflicted by the illusion of Maya, thinking himself the brother of Uttama in the bodily concept of life." So this was confusing to me, as I was under the impression that a self-realized or liberated person never falls back into Maya, or is the Maya spoken of here referring to Yoga Maya or svarupa-sakti or something instead of worldly Maya? And also in relation to this, later on in verse 4 of the following chapter, Srila Prabhupada also says, "When the master of treasury addressed him as sinless, Dhruva Maharaj, considering himself responsible for killing so many yakshas, might have thought himself otherwise. Kavera, however, assured him that actually he had not killed any of the yakshas, therefore he was not at all sinful. He did his duty as a king as it was ordered by the laws of nature." So I found this passage to be even more confusing, because now it appears that Srila Prabhupada is saying that Dhruva was sinless despite killing of the yakshas, which it seemed that he deemed in the earlier purport as being an action under the influence of Maya. So I was wondering if you could please clarify and harmonize this. Thank you.
Well, I'll be brief on this, and I think that it suffices to say that paradigmatic figures like Dhruva or Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita, despite their status in standing in bhakti, at times display a nature that appears to be that of one conditioned by the influence of the Maya Shakti. And through that, and such examples, the sacred texts like the Gita or the case of Arjuna or the Bhagavad, and there are many figures there like this, paradigmatic figures. Through them, we learn something ourselves. So again, look at Arjuna. He's a liberated person, eternally liberated, and still he's suffering from delusion, and appears in the Bhagavad Gita. So sometimes such arrangements are made by the Lord's internal energy to use such persons and through them to teach something. Another question?
Panchatatva, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Haribol Maharaj.
Hari.
I was reading in Brihad Bhagavatamrita, a really beautiful verse that came across. was regarding when Gopakumar was just coming back to the Prakat Lila, and Krishna was coming forward with his entourage. And Sanatana Goswami describes the cows as mooing in the background to Krishna's flute and harmonizing with the flute. It's so beautiful. And Gopakumar could just hear in the distance this murmuring with the cows and the flute, and his heart melted. And that was his first introduction. And then the next verse brought Krishna further, a little bit further towards Gopakumar, and the description became more insightful, and it specifically mentioned that Krishna's hair was decorated with the Vrindavan dirt, if you will, kicked up into his face, and Krishna was brushing the hair from the cows. And so it made me wonder, or wanted to ask you about the services that the cows perform, other than obviously just, you know, giving milk and pleasing Krishna in different ways. And also the bhava, the Sai Bhava. I think I've asked you before and you told me it was Vatsalya, but it seems like they're going into Sakya-rasa as well. They go into the forest.
So what's your question precisely, exactly? About the cows?
About the cows, the service they perform, if there's any other obvious services, and what the bhava is, the sthayi bhava is, the cow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are beautiful descriptions from Brihad Bhagavatamrita, Krishna's associates in the village are those who Gopakumar, as he enters into the apricot Leela, I think that's the section you're talking about, are all waiting for Krishna to return. And the dust of the herd cows is a signal, and of course Krishna's flute, and it's harmonized with the mooing of the cows and so forth. It has them all on the edge of their seats waiting for him to return, now that his return is imminent, and they've been waiting for it, of course, all day long. And Krishna plays the madhurya-rasa, which is meant to bring about rain, but it brings tears, and hearts melt, and cows let down milk, and so on and so forth. So it rains in these forms, expressions of prema. And of course, there's three basic rasas. Well, there's more, I guess, in play, but there's the cowherd boys and Krishna and Sakya-rasa, and then there's the elderly members of the village, Vatsalya-rasa, calling him back. Gopis, of course, calling him in another way, calling him back. But even if he comes back to the village, that's not going to work entirely for them in terms of wanting to have his association. So we contrast more the elders in the village waiting for his return, which is now imminent, against the cowherds in Sakya-rasa, and the pull of the forest itself in the form of all of its inhabitants pulling. There's a tension between these two extremes. In the middle of that is this Sakya-rasa going on between the Gopas and Krishna as they parade home. So the forest is losing him, and the village is gaining him, and the cows. Now the difference between the cows and the other inhabitants of the forest, there's a likeness and there's a difference. They're animals like the deers and other animals of the forest, but they're domesticated animals. So they have a closer direct connection with humans. And they are also an extension of the vatsalya-rasa. So, for example, when Krishna is leaving to go to the forest, it's the cows that are taking him. And although Yasoda and Nanda have objections, or they would like to restrain him and keep him home, that he has to go, it's his dharma, and some extension of themselves in the form of the cows, Vatsalya, does go with him, and they, in turn, bring him home. However, that said, these cows of Braj are a particular expression of Vatsalya-rasa. It has its fullest expression in human form. So if one wants to attain, for example, Vatsalya-rasa, it will be in a human form. Cows are are like a partial extension of that. It's possible that those engaged in Hangrapasana, self-worship, is a form of meditation, when that's focused on Braj, Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur points out in his commentary on Ujjvala Nilamani, they can merge with cows in Braj. That's a different thing. But otherwise, they're, like I say, an extension of Vatsalya-rasa, and it's not a position to be attained. I want to be a cow in Braj. Those who, for example, pursue the Vatsalya bhav in the Vallabha Sampradaya, it means to attain a human form there. So they are thought to be an extension of Vatsalya-rasa. Another question?
Padmanabha Swami, could you ask the last question from the Spanish-speaking devotees?
Well, I hurried up there. We have 15 minutes now for the last question.
No, just from the Spanish-speaking devotees. There are more questions. Yeah.
Okay.
So there's 3 more, including the one that's coming up.
Looks like a long one. Well, generally, santa-rasa is not thought to be present in Braj. When Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami speaks about the benediction of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu giving the opportunity for Braj Bhakti to the world, he mentions the 4 bhavas, Charibhav, Dasya, Sakya, Vatsalya, and Madhurya. And santa-rasa is a couple of types of santa-rasa, but characteristically, the object of that form of passive adoration, that form of love, is focused on the Paramatma feature of the Absolute. So that would mean, for example, 400 Narayan, it would manifest as in Vaikuntha. And characteristically, those in santa-rasa are not concerned with the leelas of Krishna or the qualities of Krishna, just the vision of the form of Krishna. Let's call it, to use a Catholic term, the beatific vision. So it's a passive rasa, and with regard to madhurya-rasa, it's in conflict with madhurya-rasa. Those who are in santa-rasa, who might participate in Braj would typically be rishis, like say Dhruva comes to Braj, makes an appearance there. That said, in maybe the last verse of Bhakti-rasamrita Sindhu, the last verse of one of the last chapters, I can't recall, does describe Krishna as a rasika rather than as rasa. As rasa, he's the object of love for all the different rasas, but also he is rasika, he's a taster of love. So the devotees are the object of his love. So there's a beautiful verse there, just like there's the verse in the Bhagavatam that's famous that describes how Krishna is the object of all forms of rasa, and is seen in this way through different eyes subjectively when slaying Kamsa in Mathura. The Gopas saw him this way, the Kamsa saw him as fear personified, and so on and so forth. So all the different 5 primary and 7 secondary rasas of Rupa Goswami, all 12 of them, Krishna is seen as the object of them. So that's a verse that for the Bhagavatam that stands as evidence for the idea that Krishna is Rasaraj. He's the object of rasa for all the rasas of Rupa Goswami. But the other verse I'm speaking about goes the other way and speaks of how he is a taster of all the rasas. And the examples that are given, I believe, are all from Braj, and santa-rasa is also mentioned there. So I forget exactly what he says. I mean, I think he just speaks about a certain temperament of Krishna. I don't have the text here to look it up. I do have the text here to look it up somewhere. It would be nice to perhaps pull it out. Give me a second. And so from that, we can draw that there is, opposed to, despite what I've said, really, I think it's the end of the 8th chapter of the last wave. If I can find it soon enough here without taking up too much time. Yeah. So with regard to Shanta, in the verse, well, through lifting Govardhan, he remained without pride in himself. Shanta. So he's tasting santa-rasa in Braj. With the small children, he became eager to hold the mountain. He smiled, hasya, vatsalya. He spat at some smelling bad yogurt, vibhatsa. He showed off his great strength, lifting the mountain for the benefit of his dear friends, Sakya, Vira. Vira means showing his heroic nature and so forth. He displayed red eyes looking at Indra, Rodra, which was anger. He shed tears on seeing the suffering of the inhabitants of Vraj from the rain and wind. Karuna means pity. He trembled in fear before the elders, having destroyed the sacrifice of Indra. So he showed dasya and bhayankar, servitude and fear. His eyes opened, or experienced them. His eyes opened wide with astonishment on seeing the torrents of rain, adbhuta, so wonder, astonishment. His hair stood on end when he saw the young girls. Madhurya, may the master, the lifter of Govardhan, protect you. So it's a nice verse. It seems to be an original verse of Rupa Goswami. It ends the 8th wave, which is the second to the last chapter of the whole text, the Bhakti-rasamrita Sindhu. And again, Jiva Goswami makes a comment. Amani prideless means that Krishna exhibited santa-rasa in being devoid of pride at lifting Govardhan hill. So he explains that rasa in that way. So Krishna is tasting santa-rasa in Braj, but none of the inhabitants of Braj are described either as objects of his santa-rasa or as shelters of santa-rasa. That said, Pujya Patrita Maharaj may have made a comment like that. Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur in some places made a comment like that, speaking of the inanimate objects of Braj in santa-rasa. So they're entitled to different perspectives. They may at times see in that way or have cause to write about it in that way. But from the founding acharyas and the seminal texts, like the works of the Goswamis, Chaitanya Charitamrita, and so forth, we find that Dasya, Sakya, Vatsalya, and Madhurya are the four rasas of Braj. And santa-rasa is something we're particularly not interested in. Neither is it typically interested in what we're interested in. So no problem there. What else?
Chitta? Let me see if I can unmute him.
We might have lost him.
Wait, try talking now. I can't see him on the grid.
I saw
Yeah.
him earlier, but I don't see him now.
Okay. Sharda, do you want to ask your question and then we'll go back to Chitta?
Haribol, I would like to ask a question about the definition of grace, especially in the context of receiving the grace of Lord Nityananda.
That's your question?
Yes.
Well, I think that in bhakti, our progress is determined by two factors, grace and effort. And this is opposed comparatively to the other paths to transcendence, yoga and jnana, which are primarily, if not exclusively, effort-based. I think more so in Gyan and the Gyan of Shankar, which is prominent, Advaita Vad. So there's a emphasis on effort, and those are thought from our perspective to be ascending paths, whereas bhakti is a descending path, avaroha panta. So bhakti descends. We know that bhakti is constituted of Krishna's internal Shakti. It's what makes his world of Leela go round. It's what gives the absolute qualities, Leelas, form, and so on and so forth. And so when that influence makes ingress through sadhu sangha into our hearts, then we've received grace in the opportunity for bhakti. And without that, well, then you can't get it by effort or earn it. so to speak. So ours is a descending path. Now our effort comes in, and I often like to say that our effort is very different than the effort in Gyan and yoga. We make an effort to get grace. So, this is an effort. You have to hold your hands up. You have to, exercise your heart and so forth, and all your sincerity. So to increase the dispensation of grace, to attract the associates of Krishna, his svarupa-sakti, to bestow their glance of benediction upon us. So that's a general idea, in brief, of grace. When it comes to Nityananda Prabhu, then it's not hard to get his grace. He's very, very generous. So, for example, he said in the poems of Bhaktivinoda Thakur to have set up a marketplace in Navadvip where he's selling the holy name only for the price of one's faith. So he's characteristically his contribution in one sense amongst the members of the Panchatattva in terms of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's dispensation is to widely circulate it. He's responsible for Advaita is responsible for his descent in one respect. Nityananda is responsible for the widest circulation and distribution of a dispensation. So he's really an extension of the grace of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, who took sannyas, for example, in order to facilitate his desire to distribute bhakti with that same method that he employed. Taking sannyas restricted him in some respects, because as a sannyasi, he would be respected, and so people would listen to him, good, but then there were places that he couldn't go, whereas if he did go there, they would disrespect him, places of ill repute. So he extended himself through Nityananda Prabhu to go to those places. Therefore, he told Nityananda to marry, and Nityananda went to the most downtrodden people and so forth. So it's not hard to get the grace of Nityananda Prabhu. You simply have to ask for it. And if you don't ask for it, it's said that Chaitanya Mahaprabhu gave bhakti to whoever asked for it. Nityananda Prabhu gave it to those who didn't ask for it. And maybe those who didn't even want it and objected to it, like Jagai and Madhai. So famous examples in Navadvip. So you've chosen an easy way, an easy person to focus on in terms of getting its grace. I mean, it really requires your sincerity of heart and appeal. And if it's focused on him as a generous benefactor, then it will certainly be fruitful in short time. What else?
Thank you. Thank you. Hare Krishna.
Oh, it doesn't. Oh, okay. Chitta's back. Do you want to ask your question, Chitta?
Sure. My question has to do with one of the young volunteers here and I were discussing God one day, and he said he didn't accept or understand why an all-powerful being would require worship. And if you could speak to that.
Well, I don't think that he requires worship, but I think that, let me give you an example. Ask your friend there to go with you, or ask him to remember, if he's ever been, to a place on earth that is a very powerful manifestation of nature that is awe-inspiring and beautiful. Like here as you know, if you ride from Audari to the coast to Elk, you get there and there's the cliffs and the Pacific Ocean. It's very awe-inspiring. Or if you walk in the forest of redwoods where there are trees big enough to build a house in, you're displaced from your unthinking kind of way of seeing your functioning as if you're the object around which everything is functioning. People don't necessarily think like that, but they function like that. So you see you come in touch with a powerful manifestation of nature that's very beautiful and also awe-inspiring. It creates within you a venerable type of attitude. Naturally, it just happens. Because of the nature of that powerful manifestation of nature, its beauty, its wonder, its expanse, its the inability in your mind for it to fit it within. It just doesn't fit within between your ears. It's too big for that. And so there's just a natural tendency to have regard for it. It's not asking for it. It's just the way it is. It's the way it is. And it does that to us. Now, if you were to take, and Krishna mentions in the Gita in the 10th chapter, amongst bodies of water, I am the ocean. Amongst trees in California, I am the redwoods, and so forth. To extend that, this is what he's saying. So if you put all this together, what it means is if you were to take all of the Grand Canyon, I don't know, I'm from the United States, so the Amazon, I mean, wow, I flew over the Amazon on my way to Brazil last year, or the year before. It was just fascinating. Whatever it might be. If you were to take all these powerful manifestations of nature that just by their very just being what they are, draw out from us a reverential attitude, and you put them all together, and then you multiply that a millionfold. That is the. You get some idea what Krishna looks like. I mean, just beyond word. That you could just try to put it together. Now, how you will feel if you come in His presence of God. He's not like demanding you should worship me, but He's commanding just by the very nature of who He is and who we are, how small we are in comparison. And the fact that He will bring us close to Him. This is Krishna, not to be worshipped. Krishna, that manifestation of the Godhead, the fountainhead is particularly not asking to be worshipped. He says, this worship is boring. People do that, but it creates some distance between themselves and me. I want them closer. That's what the Vraja Lila is. Of course, that's a step to take your friend. That's a greater distance. But again, I think that this is a good example that I've given to say just the very nature of God is that His greatness and our smallness foster this naturally. Does that help?
Yeah, that works.
You can say that God doesn't require a temple, would be another example. That's true. But we do. If you can't see God everywhere, then make a temple, say He's here. And then focus your worship there in that place. And then eventually you'll see He's everywhere. And then you will have a kind of reverence towards every manifestation of nature, even by seeing it as his Shakti in relation to Him. I mean, just the play of the material world is fascinating, even for the atheist who looks into it, for example, through science. It's just like fascinating. And they say, why do I need God? And you could say, yeah, you don't, but that is God. That is God from our point of view. That's one of his shaktis. So you're okay. You know, we worship him in a different form. You're revering him for his what he's doing there. So there's no atheist, really. So, all right, I think we've answered a good number of questions. I don't know if we got to all of them today, but we're a little over time. So,
You got to all of them.
okay, well, I'm doing better. Thank you all for your time, and I hope to be with you again next week.
Thank you.
Hare Krishna. Gaur Bhaktivinoda ki jai.
Bye.
Ribo.
Archana, do you have any announcements, or were you good? I don't. Okay.
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Well, I'm going to take that as a no. Thank you, everyone. Haribo.
Haribo.